Paranormal King Radio Network, bringing you the best paranormal hosts and guests. Bringing you the best paranormal shows and features. Playing the top musical artists from around the world. Paranormal King Radio Network. With the best paranormal hosts and guests. The best in paranormal shows and features. Playing the best musical artists from around the world. Paranormal King Radio Network. The paranormal will never be the same.
You are listening to Paranormalities and Ponderings with the C.A.S.P.I.R Paranormal team. Brought to you by the Paranormal King Radio Network and hosted by Frank Lee. Join us for the next hour as we discuss ghosts, spirits, hauntings, and other worldly phenomena that has yet to be explained in hopes of finding answers. This show is meant to be a resource for those of you who, like us, seek to find answers to the unknown. We hope you find it informative and enjoy the show. Once again, thank you for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to Paranormalities and Ponderings. I'm Frank Lee, I'm your host, and tonight we have a very special show for you. We've got a great guest tonight that we're bringing to you. He is one of the best people that we could think to bring to the show for you. You know, our goal here is to bring education, someone you can learn from, and it doesn't get any better than the guest we have tonight, Mr. Loyd Auerbach. How are you tonight?
Doing fine, thanks, Frank.
Well, great. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And so you've been quite busy here lately, from what I can tell.
Teaching classes here and there, yeah. That's keeping me busy, and then I've got a couple of events up in Idaho coming up, and the Forever Family Foundation's annual conference on the afterlife, which is going to be a dynamite conference in Durham, North Carolina in early November.
Right, and that's and the Forever Family Foundation, now they work quite a bit with doing the psychic research and the ESP, and that's
not so much ESP as they support research into areas that connect with life after death. So they do a lot of research, or support a lot of research in mediumship, looking into whether mediums are real or not, and then support research in other areas such as reincarnation research and out-of-body experience, just really almost anything that connects to that. So certainly the ghosts and hauntings phenomena absolutely fits in there. And I've been president of the foundation since the beginning of 2013, and it looks like I'm going to be continuing for a couple more years after this one.
Awesome. And that's excellent work.
Yeah, and it's free for people to join. I just mentioned that they can go to foreverfamilyfoundation.org, and they can join for free, and they get some material from them, and it's a good community.
And now something on that subject, there's a lot of people that I talk to that have had near-death experiences that...
Yeah, that fits in there too.
So that would also be something that would be a great resource for them.
Yeah, and our conference every year is kind of a combination of science and practice in the sense that we have speakers, some of the top speakers on the subject, such as near-death experiences and reincarnation and apparitions and mediumship. And then we also have some mediums who do readings during, like in between.
Oh.
So you're not just getting plain science or, other stuff. You're actually getting a little entertainment too.
Oh wow, that's awesome, because I actually had a near-death experience myself as a child, so that's
You
always
did?
yes.
It's unusual for children to have that.
I did, and when I was 6 years old, I had a severe reaction to anesthesia and was actually out for 6.5 minutes.
Wow.
And when I came to, I described what happened in very plain detail, and a few things that everyone else in the room didn't quite see. So that was rather fascinating to everyone. So that's always been one of my personal interests, as well as the paranormal, was the near-death experiences.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah, and I assume you know about the International Association for Near-Death Studies, which looks into that area quite a bit.
Right. So, well, I have to ask. So, I mean, you've got a resume that, is just it. Your biography speaks for itself as far as the paranormal goes, as far as your research goes. Well, what was it that made you start? What sparked that interest to bring you into all of it?
Well, it was a series of events, a series of interests. I have always been interested in psychic phenomena, which covers the range of from ESP to mind over matter to ghosts, and ever since I was a little kid. And that's probably a result of having a TV set in my room when I was 2, because my dad worked for NBC, and being able to pretty much watch whatever I wanted, which included old shows like The Twilight Zone and particularly One Step Beyond, which dramatized actual reported psychic experiences, and the old TV show Topper, which had friendly ghosts. So that really got me kind of hooked in there. I was also a little science geek as a kid, really, into astronomy and geology, and so I had a kind of broad interest. Comic books and science fiction, shows like Star Trek and especially Dark Shadows got me to the library looking for books on parapsychology, and so I actually found books probably when I was 11 or 12 by J.B. Rhine and J.G. Pratt and some of the luminaries in the field of parapsychology, and then found friends at school and teachers to support us. We had a parapsychology club in high school. So I started early.
Wow. And that's so awesome that you had a parapsychology club in high school. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was an interesting challenge to get it approved, just because the principal just kind of had this blank look on his face, like, what the hell are you talking about, kid? It wasn't that he was opposed to it, he just thought it was kind of, just he couldn't figure it out. And it was letters from a couple of area parapsychologists. I lived outside of New York City in Westchester County, and was very fortunate through one of my neighbors to meet a couple of my late colleagues, Montague Ullman and Gertrude Schmeidler, and they wrote letters for us. And then I wrote to J.B. Rhine, the most famous person in parapsychology, and he wrote a letter of support for us to have the club in high school.
Oh, wow. So, and I can imagine, because I've got a daughter that's in high school as well, and she's actually an apprentice investigator on their paranormal team, and she's also got those same interests, so she's kind of going through some of that as well. And as a matter of fact, she's taking biomedical sciences, and she was mentioning to her biomedical sciences teacher today, hey, guess who my dad's going to have on his radio show tonight? And they were talking about that, and we were in a local magazine, and so she's got some buzz going there and trying to stir up some interest, but not quite having as much luck.
Yeah, I think part of what we weren't focused on ghost hunting so much. We were really looking at ESP and how it was researched, and mind over matter, PK, and how it was researched, and certainly about the idea of life after death. And because we were, the club was approaching kind of the whole range of things, which is really appropriate in parapsychology. If you're doing ghost hunting, you kind of need to know about the other stuff too, because it's all involved.
Exactly.
we had a lot more support. And that and having two science teachers, the earth science teacher and the physics teacher at my high school, were both not only interested but supportive of the club. And one of them sponsored, and the other one, who was from India originally, had had a whole bunch of psychic experiences growing up. So it was really, you can find people if you really approach them right.
Right. So, and that something that you had just mentioned is something that I've never quite understood. It's like I've seen so many paranormal investigators completely overlook they want to kind of ignore psychic abilities, ESP, telekinesis, telepathy. They don't want to focus on any of that research while a person's still living, but then they want to focus on it after a person dies, and when it becomes into more of the, instead of the psychokinesis, or instead of telekinesis, they want to focus on psychokinesis. And
telekinesis is a form of psychokinesis. It's PK, psychokinesis, means movement by the mind, and telekinesis is a very limited form of that. Psychokinesis covers, I bet they don't know that it covers things like psychic healing, and even self-healing, and effects on computers and such. So it's kind of a broader topic. But if a ghost moves something, that's psychokinesis. It's telekinesis. It's still mind over matter, and you can't. It's not like you can get the ghost to cooperate and do things to research that. You actually have to work with living people, because that makes much more sense for the research.
Exactly, and that's something I've always thought is, why not study that, and because it would just make sense to me. If we can study that on a living person, then could we not apply some of those principles and try that with that consciousness not be the same after a person passes?
Exactly.
Or at least similar.
You're exactly right, yeah. And then you also have to consider the fact that, ghosts really can't see us with eyes. They don't have any eyes.
Right.
Not physical eyes. They're certainly not seeing light the same way we do. So how are they seeing us? And what our best model is that they're doing it psychically. So in other words, ghosts are using ESP to interact with us, to connect with us. So you kind of have to, you can't leave ESP out of the equation at all. And it frustrates me when I try to talk to a lot of ghost hunters, certainly not all, that they're not interested at all even in the history of ghost hunting. They don't even have any interest in that, mainly because if it's anything from before, more than 5 years before the TV shows, they don't care.
Right. And me personally, I feel that TV shows should come with a warning label attached to them.
Yeah, they really should. There's always a lot of skeptics saying that psychics should always say that this is for entertainment purposes only, and really every single one of those shows should say this is for entertainment purposes only.
Exactly.
It's not like the people who are on the show are the ones who are editing the show, or the ones who are guiding the show's message. It is the network and it is the producers who do that. And they usually know absolutely nothing, nor do they care about what's actually going on. They just want to produce a show that's going to get them ratings.
Exactly. And that's absolutely true. I've seen where they would do live investigations broadcast before, and people don't realize that a live investigation is not action-packed. It may be boring. It may be hours of absolutely nothing.
It's a stakeout, and it's only part of the investigation. That's the thing, is that an overnight stakeout is not an investigation. You actually have to research and talk to witnesses and do a lot of other things.
Right, and like I've said many times, is people tend to over-glorify the investigation itself, and they don't really look at the investigation for what it is. I've always said that the investigation is part of a diagnostic process.
That makes good sense, yeah.
And of course, now my team, I've always felt that, and from your work, I know that we're in agreement on this, that the people are much more important than the location in a haunting.
Absolutely, and even if the location is responsible for the phenomena, without people, without witnesses, you got nothing. You're not actually investigating anything. You have to, an investigation starts with a question or an event, and you need to actually investigate that. So investigating whether there is something there, is no different than bird watching. You go out into the woods and you try to spot a bird. Is that an investigation?
Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean that's what we're seeing on TV, and that's what we see people do. But that's actually not an investigation. Right. You need to have reports of the particular bird you're looking for first. If you just go out there thinking, "Oh, this is woods. There should be these birds there," even though there's never, nobody's ever seen one here. You have to actually have a starting point. And the other thing to remember that people tend to ignore is that some place might have been haunted years ago and might not be haunted anymore. So you need not only witnesses, you need current witnesses, people having experiences recently. And ignoring the ghost story, ignoring the people's experiences, what they have to say, and I hear ghost hunters say it's because it's anecdotal evidence, and that's worthless. And yet they'll go in, and all of a sudden, if they feel something, they claim that that's proof. That's no different than what the witness says, and in fact, I would believe the witness over the ghost hunter every time.
Right. I would agree. I would definitely agree. I have a great question in the chat room, actually, about your opinion on if a poltergeist is a created entity and a person, if a person creates that type of haunting.
Well, poltergeist phenomena, the term poltergeist, even if you go back in the literature to the 16th century when the term was coined, refers to a very specific type of paranormal activity, which is physical activity. And it may be rapping sounds, which everyone can hear, physical things moving around, things breaking, electronic effects, but it's purely physical. You have very, very rare poltergeist cases where things are seen like, even shadowy figures are seen. There's no apparitions, no ghosts seen. And we have pretty much come up with a model that has tested out in the laboratory, in the laboratory of the real world, not even in the controlled laboratory. We can get these things to stop. That living people are responsible for poltergeist activity most of the time. And certainly if we call it a poltergeist, it's living people. It's living agent PK, mind over matter, that's happening. It's usually, and this is about 2/3 of the cases, someone stressed out in the situation, and they may be going through some psychological or emotional or even physiological stresses that in this particular case, how they blow off steam is by throwing things unconsciously. There's an unconscious psychokinetic effect. In other cases, those people might, beat up on their brother, or they might do some sports, or unfortunately, in the worst of these cases, where people keep things bottled up, they might go postal and kill somebody. So it's all kind of in the same line of that. And then 1/3 of them are neurological. We've had evidence that about 1/3 of the poltergeist agents in one sample of over 100 had some form of neurological disorders, very minor sometimes, but either epileptic-like activity in the brain or even full-on epilepsy. And we think that the poltergeist activity in those cases may actually almost be a seizure that's being directed outward instead of inward. But we can get work with these people and get the stuff to stop. And you bring in psychics and mediums, they don't pick anything up. I mean, all the signs are there that it's not about dead people; it's about living people.
And if I recall correctly, in some of your research, you actually narrowed down specific groups that tend to be more prone down to age ranges and genders.
Well, it's hard to say who's more prone, but it does seem that in the research that's been done around the world, that the age range tends to be adolescence, which means from about 11 or 12 to early 20s. That's about 65% of the poltergeist agents. And of course, the stereotype, thanks to Stephen King, is the teenage girl.
Right.
But even that, when we look at male and female poltergeist agents, we tend to find that it's only a little, like 51% female to 49% male. So it really depends what the population statistics are. If the area is 40% female and 60% male, you get a 40-60 split. So it's not one sex over the other, but it does tend to be adolescence because of the stress levels.
Right.
the hormones and everything. But I had a poltergeist case with a woman in her early 80s.
Oh, wow.
So it really ranges. We even have poltergeist cases where we had teenagers in the house, but it turned out it was one of the parents that was causing it. Although the parent was stressed out because of the teenager, so
right.
I guess he caused it.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I've got to.
Yeah, I'm sure. I even had a case, I had a case where there was an apparition who had nothing to do with the poltergeist activity, except that the stress of there being a ghost there freaked the family out so much that there was a poltergeist.
So
the ghost wasn't moving things. One of the unconscious of one of the family members who was so freaked out about the ghost was doing it.
That would make absolutely perfect sense, because, you know, you mentioning the fear and the stress, because I was just having this discussion with someone yesterday about how anxiety and fear has more physical effects than it does emotional and mental effects.
Yeah, it does. It does. And we see that actually even in day-to-day life, and it's really stress and anxiety that we all experience a lot more than anything else. And that has an impact, or can have a real impact, on our electronics around us. Mm-hmm. There was research on PK back in the late 70s, early 80s on human-machine interaction, looking at how moods of people and their stress levels affected even the fledgling PCs and computers around them at that time. And it's only gotten more active because of all the electronics around us these days.
Right. And, you know, we were talking shortly before the show. You know, I'd mentioned how I'd read your book, you know, ESP, Hauntings and Poltergeist, and how many times I've recommended that book. And to anyone listening, that book, if you haven't read it, get it. It's that book is awesome. If you're on a team, get that book. Have all your investigators read it. That is the holy grail of investigation.
I'll mention that book is out of print, but it's available. You can find it pretty easily used. Just don't spend a lot of money on it. You can also email me or go to my website and email me from my website. My website's mindreader.com, and my email is profparanormal, like Professor Paranormal, so profparanormal@gmail.com. And I sell a PDF of that book for $5, and along with that, you get a couple of audio files, kind of extras for that.
And that is money well spent, because the information in there will definitely help you. I was just, like we were just talking, I read that book back in '97, and that was the book that prompted me to shift from being a spectator to actively engaging in research. There's so much useful information in there that I still use today. And so I'll definitely mention that. And another one was the Paranormal Case book. I've learned so much from that book as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that book was a favorite of mine, you know, talking about my cases, both paranormal cases and also a couple of non-paranormal cases, ones that turned out not to have paranormal explanations, but very unusual normal explanations. Kind of a fun thing.
Right, absolutely. And the thing of it is that with the Paranormal Case book, it was such a valuable resource, because it does show things that would seem paranormal and show the rational explanations for them, and that makes for such a good reference, because you do run into that. I've had things where, you know, it turned out to be bad wiring.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, you know, I can't. There's very few cases I've ever had, even the most active hauntings or apparition cases I've had. At least some of the things the witnesses reported turned out to be having normal explanations. Mm-hmm. So, you know, every case that we do, we look at the overall case. So is it paranormal? Is there a ghost here? Is there a haunting, an imprint here? Is it a poltergeist? But then we look at each of the things that the people report, and we can say, okay, that one, that's connected to the ghost. That over there, nope, that's an electrical effect, or that's a truck going down the street, and that's why the picture fell off the wall. You know, we can kind of pin those things down. Because you gotta separate what may be paranormal from what's pretty much not, in order to study it, in order to figure out what that's going. That's the process of investigating.
Exactly. And you know, as I'd mentioned, I've always been fascinated by, you know, psychic phenomena, ESP. I've always believed that there were so many things that so much more potential that people had that that were left untapped, that we tend to not realize we have. And Mind Over Matter, that's another excellent book that I would recommend. And to anyone who's also fascinated by those, I'm going to throw that one out there.
Thank you.
Which brings me to the current book you're working on, or that you've just released, that I haven't got to read yet, which I'm anxiously waiting to get the chance to read, ESP Wars, which is about one of my favorite military projects throughout history that has always intrigued me. And so could you tell everyone listening a little bit about that?
Sure. ESP Wars East and West, which I co-authored with Edwin C. May and Victor Rubel, is an account of, our subtitle actually is an account of the military use of psychic espionage. Mm-hmm. And we have essentially brought in various people who were involved on both the U.S. and the Soviet-Russian side. Ed May was the project director, the program director of Stargate from 1985 to when the program closed in 1995, and has continued working with a few of the remote viewers from that project post the end of the project, although in a non-governmental way. And we have contributions from General Alexei Savin, General Boris Ratnikov, and General Nikolai Sham, all of whom were involved in one way or another in the Russian work. And actually, General Sham wrote the foreword to our book, and if you looked him up, you'd find that he was the deputy director of the KGB during the fall of the Soviet Union.
Wow.
And Boris Ratnikov was an aide to Boris Yeltsin. And Savin is still active in Russia, although he's mostly retired these days. But they all were involved, especially Savin and Ratnikov, in working with psychics and training psychics and doing remote viewing and other work over there during the Soviet years and also afterwards. So the book really is kind of the story of both sides. And some of the Russian stuff is really, really interesting. When I was working on the book, getting this Russian stuff from straight out of the horse's mouth, because it had just been translated from interviews with these people. It just was kind of mind-blowing. It gives you a different picture. First of all, it gives you a different picture of the KGB, which is kind of interesting. Ratnikov and Savin were connected to the KGB. And that in itself is really interesting. The politics there and how much sometimes some of the psychic information that they got or pretended to get influenced certain Russian leaders in ways that prevented from them from getting into certain wars. So
absolutely,
it's really kind of cool that the U.S. side, very interested in the politics of all that, how the program even happened and why it shut down. And I think there's an awful lot for folks who are interested not just in psychic phenomena and remote viewing, but if they're interested in politics of black budget and other projects. This is kind of interesting too, the way things work on our side.
Well, now, if I recall correctly, the program didn't only study the remote viewing and a few other things, but no, if I recall correctly, there are a few major finds that the program is credited for.
Yeah, there were, the program is, and we even have a letter from a senator in the book that credits the program, the early program, with actually affecting Reagan's decision to go ahead with the MX missile program, which some of your older listeners might remember had to do with taking missiles and putting them on trucks and carting them around on a kind of a railroad track, a 60-mile railroad track, and so the Russians didn't know where they were, so they couldn't actually shut them down. And they tested with some of the remote viewers to see if they could pinpoint where they were at any given time. And the viewers had enough luck or enough skill to do that this very expensive program was actually scrapped. So they did have a contribution to that. There were typically during the years of the Stargate program, what was going on was that the CIA, the Defense Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, the NSA, whoever, and it was mostly the overseas agencies, not the NSA so much. But what they asked the viewers to do was they would give them targets where they had simply run out of options to figure out what was going on at those places. They had no way to know. They had no way to figure out what were at these locations. Maybe there was someone who was kidnapped. They had no way to know where that person was. So all the normal intelligence avenues were actually exhausted. And so these viewers were tasked with that, and they would be given this information. And in about 15 to 20%, Ed was a little bit, I guess you could say, conservative in his estimate in the book, but he said 15%. It was really closer to 20%. Of those particular viewings had actionable intelligence. The way our intelligence agencies work, however, they don't work on just one source. They had to actually get some verification of some of it. But there were some really major hits. In fact, there's even a video on YouTube with Joe McMoneagle talking about one of the major hits we talk about in the book, where he was given a location in the Soviet Union and asked to view this huge warehouse that was a mile and a half or so inland and only had a little channel next to it. Lots of actual activity that was going on, military trucks, all sorts of construction stuff that was there, and they just really didn't know what was inside that warehouse. And we had a spy satellite photo of this warehouse, and we had no people on the ground who could tell us what was going on, what they were building. They were clearly building something.
Right.
So Joe's viewing indicated something that was absolutely outrageous, and that was a double-hulled, huge submarine. A few months later, what ended up happening was they started getting spy satellite photos, which everybody scoffed at his viewing, at what he got, because that sounded so absurd, especially building it inland.
Right.
And a few months later, they started digging a trench, and the trench got bigger and bigger and became a channel, and then they roll out the Typhoon-class submarine and floated it to the sea, just as he described it. We even have images in the book of both the submarine as it ended up and what Joe drew.
Right, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't they also find a couple of American spies that were working for the KGB through this program?
There was some of that was going on too. It was done kind of in turn for assessment of personnel from time to time. There are a lot of there's something like 80,000 pages of declassified documents out there. And Ed May is actually working on getting the funding up and a publisher to actually publish the Stargate archives, which at this point he puts at what he's going to, at the good stuff that he's putting in this archive he wants to, is a little over 1 million words. So it's 10 very large volumes. And that's not, and then there are still things, some missions or tasks that they were given that they can't talk about because they were, even though all this other stuff was classified, the time for a lot of this stuff is past, but there's still some things that are still time sensitive, so they're still classified.
Right, but I mean, just even these few things that we've mentioned, I mean, are just, if you think about it, these people sitting in a room, places they've never been, places they're told to sit there and concentrate on a place, essentially. And they're uncovering, like you mentioned, a submarine a mile inland, or several miles inland, in a warehouse. And, they're screening these people. They're finding these, they're finding weapons, they're finding missiles, they're finding, these people that are, spying for the KGB. And all of these concrete results are coming from this program. And these are just a few instances, but that is quite significant when you consider they're sitting there just thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the thing. It's amazing to think that people can do this, and yet people do it. And some people can do it very well, and other people can learn to do it pretty well. It seems that everybody has an aptitude for some form of ESP. And what's really interesting is that Joe, I know a bit, and I know one of the other viewers, Angela Ford, and they got to be a certain level of how good they were, but not much better than that. And it seemed like they topped out at a certain level. They certainly short of becoming superheroes.
Right.
Having a superpower. And it seems that we may all have an aptitude or a limit, and the limit may be biological, or the limit may actually be because we can't believe it can get any better.
Mm-hmm.
So we may even set the limit ourselves by our belief systems. That's one of the things we see in research in parapsychology, that people get involved with this. And the problem with the closure of the program was a really minor program when it comes to money.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little over $20 million for 20 years, 20 plus years,
right,
which is probably less money than they spent on, porta potties.
Right, that is dirt cheap.
Yeah, it's nothing. There are most likely power tools and other things they spent more money on, and considering if they were going to spend that $20 million on something actually that could hurt people, naturally you'd rather have them do this. Mm-hmm. But the problem was that when it was turned over, in the last 2 years of the program's existence, it was turned over to the CIA from the Defense Department because the reshuffling of budget during the Clinton administration. And a lot of things got shuffled around, and the CIA just didn't want it. It was too much of a giggle factor for many of the people in the CIA. Even though they took advantage of it, they didn't want it, and they pretty much figured out a way to end the program with a report that indicated that it really didn't have any actionable intelligence, didn't have great statistics. And they did that by looking at only the last couple of years' worth of material when there were very, very few tasks even given to the viewers. In the book, we have one of the folks credited with packaging up, boxing up, and sealing up with the appropriate classified seals the material from California to send to Langley, finding after the CIA closed down the program that the boxes had never been unsealed with all the reports.
Wow.
So they never even really looked at the history of how well they did, and they said that 15% wasn't high enough, which is interesting considering that the in place, today it may be a little different because of electronic surveillance, but back then, with our assets on the ground and spy satellites and what we had in place, we were not getting, in general, not getting better than 15% from all those other assets.
Exactly.
And if they turn over the question, the ones that they can't get to remote viewers, and they get another 15%, it's not the same 15% because clearly the other assets couldn't get anything. Right. It's like adding another 15%, it's at 30%.
Right,
which is just really dumb, especially considering how cheap it is.
Right, and exactly, on such a cheap budget, you have just absolutely doubled your intel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it makes no sense, except that there is a huge giggle factor in Congress. And Ed and Joe actually spent a long time in the Pentagon, 10 years actually, trying to get the program resurrected from 95 to about 2006. And the folks on the ground, the people who were the lower level and boots on the ground, and the people who were actually in the world doing this stuff were all in favor of it. But they couldn't get anyone higher up, especially from a congressional or senatorial perspective, to sign off on it, even if it was going to be classified that it even existed. Because they didn't want to, given our politics today, they didn't want to take a chance that somebody could find out that they, are supporting a program that is so silly. And, given what's going on in Congress, that doesn't surprise me.
Right. And that's something that I can't help but wonder. Of course, me coming from a military background, I've seen how many programs go, how your black ops programs basically have a blank check. And
yeah, these guys certainly didn't have a blank check.
Right. And I can't help but wonder if it really did end, or if it was...
Well, it certainly ended with the people who were involved before.
Right.
It's not impossible that someone, that individuals, or even small groups of individuals in the military or in intelligence work, haven't found a remote viewer or two and working with them on things. That's not impossible, but there's not an actual program that's going on. That's been pretty clear. Not one that's been funded unless it's been hidden even from the House Appropriations Committee and the Intelligence Committee.
That's just always been a curiosity I've had.
Yeah, it's they tried really hard right after September 11th to get some interest, and there was some interest again on the ground, but not at the higher levels. Partly because of this giggle factor. There were other issues as well, which we talk about in the book, as to some personnel issues that kind of also may have sabotaged the resurrection of the program or the continuation of the program. But Ed's still doing research with Joe McMoneagle and Angela Ford. This is not about any sort of military or other targets, but they're trying to figure out how it's all working and common factors for these viewers. What makes them so special, even though they really weren't that special. Certainly we would never know that these people are psychic unless you ask them point blank, and they tell you.
Right.
They're very down-to-earth people.
Right. It's like like we were talking about before we actually went on the air about the movie that came out a couple of years ago, The Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yeah.
How it was such a comical movie, but how most people watched it, and they watched George Clooney doing all this goofy stuff and didn't realize that they were actually getting somewhat of a history lesson.
Yeah, there were bits and pieces, and a lot of real Easter eggs in that about the history, and then there was a lot of extrapolation and goofiness as well. Yeah, and even the whole idea of the men who stare at goats to kill the goat, to knock off the goat.
Right.
That was based on on something that actually was done, but not in that way. Technically, they should have called it the men who touched the goats.
Right.
which of course you get in a lot of trouble for calling a movie that or a book that, because people's minds go in completely different directions. But the whole concept here is something that in Kung Fu has been called the dim mak, or the delayed death blow, or death touch.
Yes.
And the idea is you use your chi to disrupt an organ by tapping someone, and not even so they can feel it, and then over the course of a couple of days or even a shorter period of time, an organ, let's say a kidney or something, explodes in their body or becomes a part from transfer of chi energy. And Guy Savelli, who was a martial artist involved with these guys, I worked with him in some PK research back in the early 80s and had him out here in California at that time also separately for a workshop. And Guy taught a bunch of these special forces guys how to do a dim mak. And actually, back in the mid-'80s, he had contacted me and let me know that he was in touch with these guys, and they'd asked him to demonstrate it. And I have to say, he sent me photographs of one of the goats that had died after he had done the dim mak to the goat. Excuse me, not ghost. To the goat. That's a Freudian slip.
Right.
And I wish he hadn't sent me the pictures, because they had the exposed internal organs of the goat, and they were kind of all messed up.
Wow.
It was pretty disgusting. And if it was as he said, teaching somebody to do that, it's like teaching somebody how to assassinate somebody, which is something that, of course, the military around the world, whatever military, they teach people to do that. But he also taught them how to shield themselves against blows and other things. And I've seen video of some special forces guys trained by him taking a 2x2 and a 2x4 whack across the back of their neck and not even being phased with it, even though the beam breaks, or at least cracks, and even a metal pipe slammed against somebody's chest, bending around the guy's chest, and the guy barely moves. So that's all stuff within the martial arts also, and it's a mind over body thing.
Right, and that's absolutely fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
It really is, and that goes back to, like you were mentioning, the mind over matter. It's, there's so much more potential than what we actually use.
Yeah, and it's not that we don't use the brain properly, it's that we don't allow ourselves to do these things. That's been pretty clear, especially with psychokinesis. It's a lot like sports performance. It's really performance psychology. If you can psych yourself up to do something athletically, you can definitely psych yourself up to do some PK. And we've seen that happen in the old spoon bending parties and even some of the workshops that I've run over the years.
Right, and that's bringing me to a question that I've always, or to a curiosity I've always had, was if everyone potentially had the ability to have psychic powers or possess these abilities, or if it was something perhaps genetic or something, how that worked. And so from what you're saying, that is something that can be learned by anyone. Yeah,
and it seems that we have aptitudes for different kinds of psychic abilities and different applications. So, everybody has a little bit of ESP, and everybody has a little bit of PK. The question is, which of us has the aptitude? Like some people might have an aptitude to learn to draw. I don't.
Right.
I can't draw well, but I've played around with just playing with sculpting things in clay. I could do that. So I have an aptitude for more 3D modeling than for flat drawing type stuff.
Right. Well, I can draw, but I can't sculpt, so there you go.
There you go. And I know people can paint but can't sculpt, or who can paint but can't draw. And then there are people with music who are great percussionists, but they wouldn't know what to do with a stringed instrument. Even if you gave them a lesson or two, they still might not be able to learn how to play the guitar.
Right. So that perfect example. Example.
Yep.
So that has always been something that I've always had that curiosity about, and there's been so many people that I've talked to, and you get so many different answers about it.
And it's really interesting. One of my late colleagues was a psychic named Annette Martin, and she and I co-wrote a book called The Ghost Detective's Guide to Haunted San Francisco, which is about several places in the Bay Area. But if you read the book, you kind of get a real feel for what it's like for a parapsychologist and a psychic to work together. And we even have transcripts of our conversation and her one-sided conversation with some of the ghosts. So it's really interesting from that perspective. But Annette put out a book called Discovering Your Psychic World years ago, which is a workbook, and it's got all these different applications of ESP and PK and all these different things you could do. And you try all these exercises to see what you're good at, and then you work practicing the ones that you're good at. And Annette said, I asked her, can you do everything in this book? And she said, no, of course not. No one can do everything.
Mm-hmm.
So human beings we're not good at everything.
Right.
There's very few people who can do everything. So we have aptitudes for some types of psychic experience and abilities. That's why some people can see ghosts and other people can't.
Absolutely. And it makes perfect sense. That, some of the mediums that I've worked with, we have a couple on my paranormal team,
mm-hmm.
and that's we have one who is able to hear them more, like you
mm-hmm.
were talking about,
right?
But one tends to not hear as much, but she gets more mental images.
Sure, yeah. We also all have this perceptual process that happens too. People are surprised when I tell them I've never seen a ghost. I have felt presences, been tapped on the shoulder, had my arm squeezed.
Mm-hmm.
I have smelled smells associated with people who were deceased, and even heard a voice once, which was picked up by somebody else.
Wow.
But I've not visually seen a ghost. I've certainly visually seen things moving, but not an actual ghost. But I certainly know when somebody's around. So it's just the way that my brain is, or my mind is processing the signal from the ghost. It just doesn't get the visual signal, or doesn't let me see the visual signal.
Right. So in all of your years of working with the paranormal, what would you say was your most profound paranormal experience?
That's tough. Wow. I can tell you that I had probably the most profound from a personal experience rather than having a case that was really impactful. I actually had, back in 1999, we were doing a couple night overnight at the Moss Beach Distillery restaurant south of San Francisco. I've been investigating or working with that place for at this point now coming up on 25 years soon, since 1991. Mm-hmm. Interviewing hundreds of witnesses and being around, seeing things move. We've had a lot of really interesting stuff happening there. And we were doing a 2-night overnight, and I was behind the bar. I had 3 psychics with us that night, including Annette Martin. They were in other parts of the restaurant. I had various people. We were shooting some video on the place as well, just kind of documenting everything we were doing. And I was in the bar area after closing, and my EMF detector started going a little haywire, and of course I very quickly determined that it was the ice maker behind the bar that was doing that. But at that moment, I actually had a sense of somebody being around, like a sense of presence, and I suddenly felt this wave of sensation move through my body from front to back, and then it stopped for a moment, and then went from back to front. And this went back and happened multiple times, and I started getting a mental image of a young woman in her kind of late 20s, with her hair up, very honey blonde, very specific dress and jewelry and such. And it was definitely in my head. It wasn't in my eyes. And I also got her giggling as she's walking back and forth through me.
Oh, wow. So you're having this projected onto you.
Yeah, I'm having this experience as if the ghost is walking back and forth through me. So I started timing this. Of course, this would be the point where this guys on TV would start running screaming from the place.
Right.
But parapsychologists, we tend to get more interested and curious at this point.
Right.
So after a little over 2.5 minutes, this is still going on, and I got to tell you, it felt pretty good. Because it's very giggly, bubbly energy. Around the corner from one of the other rooms comes Annette Martin, Stosh Murray, another psychic, and one of my colleagues, Pam Heath, who is also more than a little psychic. And they all saw her. And, they stopped and said, Annette says, she's walking through you, isn't she? And then they all burst out laughing, and Stosh made a comment, and Pam made a comment. And I separated the three of them because I wanted to see what jewelry they thought the ghost was wearing, what clothing she was wearing, how her hair was done, and I had them separately interviewed. And they all saw not just what they verified each other's picture, but they confirmed or coordinated with what I actually saw in my head as well. When they started laughing, I felt the energy leaving me, and actually Stosh said, she's walking away from you, isn't she?
Wow.
So it was a really kind of profound experience. And since that time, when I'm down in that place, that ghost actually moves around. She doesn't just stay there. She's actually visited mediums in other parts of the world, for that matter, with messages sometimes for me. And I felt when she's around. So she's kind of like my personal ghost connection.
Huh. That's quite fascinating, actually.
So that's the most profound for me, but it's not the one that necessarily affected me in my field and my, the way I do investigations and such. I had a case in the 80s that did that, where the only possible explanation that there was a ghost there.
Right.
Or an incredibly elaborate hoax with no payoff for the family.
Well, I've got to ask about that.
Yeah, that was it was a case in Livermore, California. The family had called because they had realized, thanks to something their son had said to them, had opened up about having communication with this ghost that lived in the house since they moved in. And in knowing that his mother, father, and grandmother all saw the ghost as well, even though nobody was talking to each other about this. They were all keeping it close to the vest. So they'd all been seeing this ghost every now and then, but the kid had been apparently communicating with her and talking to her. And so the mother was more concerned that he was going to grow up to be a normal teenager, having a ghost to talk to every day. And we actually even had him see a therapist just to make sure that, to allay her suspicion, her fears. And the therapist who didn't believe in ghosts was incredibly complimentary about this kid being so mature. And you could only chalk it up to the fact that he had somebody to talk to every day with an adult. That would be the ghost.
Wow.
But we had information given to us in the conversation. Chris, the boy, was talking to the ghost while we were there, and we got information about the woman's only living relative, how to contact him, which was the owner of the house. Pat had been trying to do that since they moved in the house, since they got the house in an estate sale, and the only living relative was in an assisted living facility.
Wow.
Whose attorney was preventing her from contacting him. She didn't even have his name. So we got the information. We got family stories that I went to visit the guy with his permission after calling him, and I would tell him the start of a story, and he would finish the story.
Wow. So there's information coming that there is no possible explanation.
The only other possibility is that the kid somehow found a series of Lois's diaries, if they existed, and had memorized them, which was beyond his capabilities academically, but even more importantly, Pat, the owner, and her husband had gone through the entire house when they bought it in the estate sale, and they did not find anything. They couldn't find any paperwork or anything like that, nothing like that.
Wow.
And the other thing, part of this was when I asked if Lois had questions for us. There were some silly questions, but they were questions for the three of us, myself and the other two investigators, that were related directly to the conversation we had in the drive from the university to the house.
Wow.
And it was not, we certainly did not talk about those things. They had nothing to do with ghosts or anything else, the paranormal at all. And we didn't talk about any of that from the moment we walked in the house. We actually had a tape running just to make sure, to know. We went back over the tape to make sure we hadn't done that. So the only possibility there is that they bugged my car, or
right.
or Chris was a super psychic and somehow could kind of read our minds.
Wow, that is absolutely phenomenal.
You know, we get a case like that, especially with the evidence that had been gathered by the people in my field for well over 100 years. You know, that's like, you know, even if you had any question in your mind personally before that, there just is no question in my mind after that.
Exactly. That would have been enough to convince anyone at that point. I mean, it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
So now, from what I understand, you have a personal haunting by something other than ghost, more of a confectionery type haunting.
Yeah,
as
I
well.
also make chocolate under the label Haunted by Chocolate. And make small artisanal batches, and I actually conduct chocolate tasting presentations. So when people have me speak, it's not always about ghosts or the paranormal. It's sometimes about chocolate. And I got my certificate as professional chocolatier in late 2009, and started making chocolate, again, small batches in late 2010.
Right, and I was telling I was telling my oldest daughter about she studied some of your work. She's a fan also, and a couple of the members on my paranormal team who have studied your parapsychological work, but weren't aware of your chocolate making skills, had just recently found out about that, and they said there's no way that you can have him on the show without asking him about this. So
it's a fun thing. It's, you know, food is kind of my religion, so it's and chocolate's the highest form of that.
Exactly. Well, you know, if you look at chocolate throughout history, it's more than just a regular food. I mean, chocolate has been
right. It's been sacred. It's been used as money. It really has. It's the most craved substance on Earth, according to all the surveys, polls, and studies that have been done. And it may actually have more health benefits, bang for the buck, than almost anything else as well.
Absolutely. And so I had to bring that up for all of the chocoholics out there that are also into the paranormal. So that I knew they would find that interesting. Unfortunately, we're getting close to time to call it a night, and I've got to say, Loyd, it is hard to have you on for just an hour. That you have so much information, and this is really hard. I'm going to have to get you back on the show.
Sure.
I'm going to have to.
It's something my students tell me too. You know, I teach distance classes. I'm teaching a class tomorrow night about apparitions and the research and models of apparitions, ghosts, which I've got several people who are calling in to the class rather than being in the class live, in person rather. So I do all my classes with a speakerphone, so I can actually have people on the phone as well.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
And you know, if people are listening or are interested in that, they just email me again, just simply profparanormal@gmail.com, or find me on Facebook, and I can hook them up tomorrow before that. But I have other classes coming up as well, and even have recordings of those available for people too.
Awesome. So please yes, be sure to give out your website where people can find your book and find out more about you. I know you're with the Ryan Research Center also.
That's correct. Yes, I'm on the board there. So my main website is mindreader.com, and you can absolutely find links to all the major organizations and even some minor ones on my website, so I encourage you to explore those. My books, the ones that are in print, just pop my name into Amazon. That's the easiest way. And ESP Wars is available. It's not available in bookstores at this point. It's just only available through online booksellers. So Amazon's got it. Barnes & Noble's got it as well. And it will be in Kindle and Nook form in the next couple of weeks. We haven't been able to do that yet, but that'll be coming up real soon. And then, of course, my website, hauntedbychocolate.com, if you want to find out more about that.
Awesome. And then of course, and the classes that you do as well. Those will be listed on your website also.
They are on my website. Actually, they are on my website. In fact, if you go to mindreader.com now, you will see the announcement about tomorrow night's class and the one that I'm also starting Thursday night, which is a two-parter. And that's typically where I post my classes. And there's a link back to the school, HCH Institute, where I teach my parapsychological studies program, which is available distance only or live or however you want to do it. We actually make it available in a lot of ways. And I'm also teaching courses through the Ryan Center. So I'll be doing an online investigations class starting in January for the Ryan Education Center.
Awesome. And Ryan Education Center, they do so much work with paranormal, parapsychology. Wonderful organization. So, well, Loyd, it has been an honor having you on. It's been great. I appreciate it. I hope that our listeners have learned half as much as I have. And
thanks, Frank.
I hope to have you on again, and thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, and have a great Halloween.
You do the same, and thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight, and hope to see you again next week.
Thank you for listening to Paranormalities and Ponderings with the C.A.S.P.I.R Paranormal team, brought to you by the Paranormal King Radio Network. We hope you enjoyed the show, and will tune in again next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. Please be safe as you're out there, especially if you're investigating the paranormal. Take care, have a good night, and happy huntings. Thank you again from the C.A.S.P.I.R Paranormal team.